Welcome to the Numerical Tarot, a new tarot paradigm, an alternative to tradition, an axial system of archetypal crystallography, a transculturally anthropomorphized, life-biased binary influence calculator, a wisdom system and archetype enhancer with harmony of interpretation throughout. The content of all the videos in this series are excerpts, edits and brief summaries from the eBooks All Things Are Numbers and All Things Are Patterns, links below. For a more complete explanation of each idea, additional reading might be helpful. Hopefully the basic ideas come across enough to pique your interest in trying this alternative approach to tarot. People with an interest in tarot often acquire an equal interest in the concept of archetypes, as a way of understanding what it is that attracts us to images, specifically, the images we find in a deck of tarot cards. But, what is an archetype? In attempting to answer this question, many look to the famous psychiatrist Carl Gustav Jung, who utilized the idea of archetypes extensively in his attempts to understand consciousness. In his description of archetypes, we find them to be very elusive and conceptual, being compared to an axial system of crystallography. In this way, Jung intended that archetypes be thought of as invisible lines of force that determine the shape of things yet to be, whether those things are tangible entities of our external reality or intangible thoughts, feelings, and emotions of the mind. Jung described archetypes as invisible lines of force. Some people, however, will look at an iconic illustration on a tarot card and call that an archetype. Extending the vocabulary that way might be suitable to some. But those who understand the elusive nature of archetypes will usually prefer to describe them as something more intangible, ethereal, and transcendental. In describing an archetype as something ethereal and transcendental, some people come to view descriptions, even symbolic ones, as inadequate or even destructive to the true nature of what an archetype really is. To some people, an archetype, and our understanding of what it is, should remain as ephemeral as possible, in order to be as true to its nature as possible. Those who prefer to have things remain undefined in this way suggest that the true nature of an archetype can and should be known and understood only through intuition and intuitive knowing. Problem is, anybody can say that they know something is what they think it is. And by pointing out the ineffable nature of some things, and how some things can't be known any other way than individual knowing, they can avoid any obligation to explain how they know what they say they know, thus leaving us all to either believe they really know something, or that they don't. The fabric of belief is thin and fragile, and because of the blind obedience of others to those who claim to know, a thin veil of fabric is often all that is needed to hide superstitions and fallacious assertions. People believing what they know, without ever bringing to bear a critical eye of examination, are susceptible to delusions. People who are taught to believe, without ever bringing to bear a critical eye of examination, are susceptible to abuse. Religion says, believe and you will understand. Science says, understand and you will believe. Some only believe what they see. Some only see what they believe. A critical eye is necessary to pull aside the veil of ignorant belief and see things for what they are. Personally, I like how people in spy or crime movies use smoke to see the invisible patterns created by the laser beams of a burglar alarm system crisscrossing a room. By introducing smoke, analogous here to a critical eye, the crisscrossing laser beams become an invisible pattern, clothed in smoke. The smoke is not part of the pattern, but it is one way of seeing the invisible pattern. The point being that we don't have to give up just because patterns are invisible. We can choose to look deeper. When someone says we'll just know, or that some things just resonate, we can apply that to many things. In my life, I've had many strong feelings that impress, influence, and fascinate me. I've had vivid visions of archetypes and episodes of knowing and resonance. I still do. And everything I do as an artist is an effort to show what I saw and still see. Sharing is good, or at least something to do while waiting for our end. So I try to show what I see. Let's look. Sharing our knowing is not easy. Explaining is draining, in more ways than one. By explaining, we give form to the formless so that one or more of the five senses, found within another individual with whom we hope to communicate, can sense what we sense, and thereby have some chance, however slim, of knowing what we think we know. The theoretical model of existence being put forth in this study is extremely abstract and conceptual, but still, it exists. In that way, it is something for the five senses of others to examine, so that they might have some chance, however slim, of knowing what I think I know. The deeply felt feelings, utilized by the emotional affinity path to archetypal knowing, come from somewhere. We don't have to ask where, we can just know them, and never explain anything to anyone. But, if we do ask where, then where? For me, someone who is trying to explain what I think I know, the answer is patterns. To me, abstract patterns and geometrically juxtaposed concepts that create or mimic fundamental, elemental, primordial, transcendental patterns are the wisest tools to use in the communication of archetypal knowing. Through its abstract patterns, the theoretical model of existence being put forth in this study attempts to describe a universal blueprint of archetypal essence from which archetypal knowing evolves. That there is something beyond the borderline, beyond the frontiers of knowledge, is shown by the archetypes and, most clearly of all, by numbers, which this side of the border are quantities but on the other side are autonomous psychic entities, capable of making qualitative statements which manifest themselves in a priori patterns of order. Carl Jung. Many argue that all we can ever know of anything is reduced to electrical impulses in a brain. That's probably true, but there is a difference between brain and mind. To a brain, reality equals electrical impulses. However, to a mind, reality equals patterns of electrical impulses. From patterns anthropomorphized by humans, iconic representations of archetypal influence evolve into illustrations on little pieces of paper. From patterns, human behavior is shaped and archetypal influences evolve into the personality types seen by psychotherapists. The influence of archetypal essence is inherited from a divine source. Archetypal essence is transcendental. In that way, it influences everything. The influence of archetypes, or archetypal essence, is projected from its amorphous source into the finite world of the living, as a universal blueprint upon which all existence is constructed, and to which all existence connects, through the paths of emotional affinity or resonance of knowing. The archetypes are the numinous, structural elements of the psyche and possess a certain autonomy and specific energy which enables them to attract, out of the conscious mind, those contents which are best suited to themselves. Carl Jung. Like an armature attracts the clay of the artist, numinous, structural elements of the psyche attract, out of the conscious mind, those contents which are best suited to themselves. And, like an armature used by an artist, there is a structure to archetypal influence that can be understood. The theoretical model of existence being put forth in this study is intended to be just such an archetypal armature, crafted from fundamental, primordial patterns that point to the transcendental essence of knowing. We can connect to these patterns through emotional affinity and whichever of them resonate with our personality, or we can build upon the inherited influence of each of them as they project their influence into the tangible world of human expressions. In my world, an archetype is not the image, or the icon, or the personality type. An archetype is the transcendental essence, which I personally choose to know by way of a universal blueprint of primordial patterns. The details of that universal blueprint of primordial patterns can be found throughout all the videos of this series. However, I acknowledge that, for many, the image, icon, or personality type is the archetype. Ultimately, the all things are numbers approach says that there are many ways to clothe the invisible man of ideas that are infinitely drawn nowhere. The model in this study is one way. As an outgrowth of the theoretical model of existence being put forth everywhere in this study, the icons of the numerical tarot, and the isomorphic tarot, and any other deck I might draw in the future, are all anthropomorphized, representational characterizations of human existence and transcendental yantras of personified essence. They are not archetypes, but they play them in a tarot deck. In other words, the image is not the archetype. The archetype is the abstract, primordial pattern, not the anthropomorphized representation of the pattern. The theoretical model of existence being presented everywhere in this study is compared to a planet in space, with a sphere of influence, an atmosphere, a surface, a core of substance, and an infinite center. It is conjectured that these fundamental, elemental, primordial stages of existence are the true archetypes of archetypality, and that by understanding these parameters of existence, we can better understand the nature of whatever is projecting the images of tarot. All that is to be added is to point out how the anthropomorphized representational characterizations of human existence that become the most popular are the ones that people label as archetypes. But in reality, they are only anthropomorphized representations of archetypal essence. They are projected images from a transcendent projector whose essence is much less obvious than any human-born image of humanity. So the archetype is not the emperor, or even the father as much as it is the substance of existence as seen in the more abstract, less human, more conceptual parameters of a theoretical model of existence born from an evolution of even more abstract thought. Identifying an archetype as the father might be more relatable, just as the projected image in the movie theater remains more relatable than the movie projector. But, ultimately, we have to admit that the human image is not the archetypal pattern, it is the projected image of the archetypal pattern. As it's projected, we anthropomorphize it. And as we encounter other people's anthropomorphizations, we relate back to the projector of archetypality. Thus, the universality of archetypes is not to be found in the many anthropomorphizations, however popular and widespread they may be, but in the more abstract, fundamental, primordial, transcultural patterns of a transcendent projector. What is the nature of that projector? Here is a mandala that can be used to meditate on the idea of transcendental influence projecting out into the world of the manifest to become anthropomorphized representations created by humans to see the archetypal patterns. At the center is a pool of water, symbolic of the unconscious, with ripples radiating out from opposing sides, telling us to stay balanced in our perceptions. Around the square pool of water is a morphing circle where rock becomes cloud, or cloud becomes rock. Again, advocating an adherence to balance and the idea of keeping one's head in the clouds and one's feet on the ground. Radiating down from the cloud are rays of sunlight. Growing up from the ground are blades of grass. This again repeats the idea of the two-way path of archetypal influence or archetypal knowing. The sun sends us its energy, inherited influence, projecting. We then use that energy, like a blade of grass, to reach back to that source of energy, connection via emotional affinity. We turn to archetypes, like a plant turns to the sun. The metamorphic transition of tadpole to frog and caterpillar to butterfly also speaks to this two-way path. Tadpole goes from water, unconscious, to land, conscious. Caterpillar goes from land, conscious, to sky, unconscious. There is more that could be said about what an archetype is, and I do, if you want to read my books. In addition to contemplating the nature of archetypes, I also address the issue of stereotypes. Some people are insulted by the illustrations of my tarot decks, thinking that they use insulting stereotypes. But, what is a stereotype? Is there any relationship between a stereotype and an archetype? Most people think a stereotype is something bad, insulting, unflattering, or undesirable, and often conclude that such a thing could not possibly have any relationship to anything of archetypal influence like a tarot card. But why? Why can't archetypal influence contribute as much to the definition of something undesirable, unflattering, or insulting as it does to things that are considered desirable, flattering, or complimentary? As I see it, the perceptions that people have concerning the differences between these two comes from two important considerations working off each other: the intent of an author versus the perception of a viewer. Those who prefer to internalize the meaning of everything they see might view the contributions of authors to be of minimal interest. But I see the determination of good and bad as a give and take struggle. Meaning, if someone knows that the intent of an author was to present something good, in a good way, it might mitigate their perception of how bad it seems to them. Likewise, if they know the intent of an author was to present something bad in a bad way, it might limit the amount of positive spin they put on something. Here is a chart to show how I see this give and take exchange working in the creation of good and bad icons of archetypal influence, or good archetypes and bad archetypes, or a bad disparaging epitome versus a good flattering epitome. Basically, the valuation equation chart says, intent versus perception equals value. My intent versus someone else's perception determines the good or bad value of something within any given context. Thus, I believe that anyone who might accuse someone of perpetuating an insulting stereotype within their tarot deck is simply expressing their moral perception within this valuation equation, and would do well to also consider the author's moral intent before making a value judgment. A stereotype might be mean, but whether someone is maliciously stereotyping or not, labels happen. People fall into types, whether we like it or not. For the most part, it can't be helped. In falling into types, some might not like the labels that get attached to them. Others might welcome the labels that get attached to them, seeing them as liberating or as a comfortable form of establishing a desired identity. Either way, no kind of label will ever be a complete picture of who we are. We will always be individuals, with multiple facets, like a diamond. Thus, the facet that we most frequently face forward to the world, our persona, will be the label that gets used most often to describe us, like it or not. But that does not mean that other facets don't exist. It just means that it's up to each individual diamond to sparkle as much as it can. Those that don't sparkle run the risk of being stereotyped with limiting labels. Lots of people use frequency of occurrence throughout cultures as an important part of their definition of what an archetype is, by pointing to how often certain personality types reappear within and between cultures, and thereby contribute to the idea of what a collective unconscious, or what this study of consciousness calls a universal consciousness. In defining these icons of archetypal influence, very short and simple descriptions usually follow: the mother figure, the father figure, the sage, the fool, the outlaw, the explorer, the hero, the lover, etc. These are not complex, elaborate, multifaceted descriptions, they are very limited. In defining a stereotype, many claim that stereotypes are insulting because they are limited descriptions. The movie The Breakfast Club dealt with high school stereotypes. It had an assortment of characters that we see recurring again and again in our culture. They were summed up with very short descriptive titles: the brain, the jock, the criminal, the princess, the basket case, and the authoritarian as portrayed by the oppressive teacher. I knew types like the ones in the Breakfast Club movie when I was in high school. Sometimes their character was a phony facade. Sometimes it was accurate to who they really were, whether there were more facets to their personality or not. So what's the difference between an insulting stereotype and someone expressing who they are by acquiring the telltale signs of a particular type? Everyone wears a costume that says something about them that is not a complete picture of who they are. In a similar manner, characters in a movie wear costumes to help the audience know who they are. In the end, aren't we all just walking stereotypes, being judged unfairly by people every day of the week? The point of the Breakfast Club movie was to show how the costumes that people wear are not all they are about. But, at the same time, the costumes they wore were accurate to part of what they were about. So, it was the people within the movie, and the people in the audience, who were categorizing and judging unfairly. But regardless of whether any judging was occurring or not, the costumes were not inaccurate, and they did not go away at the end of the movie. Each character remained a representation of their type, in spite of all the showing of other facets to their existence. Their dominant facet did not go away. It remained forward as a primary representation of their persona, and they took on a certain pride in their defined identity with that major facet. Stereotyping links a single person with a group with which they may or may not want to be associated. Take the jock from The Breakfast Club as an example. Some people don't mind having the label jock attached to them, because it implies some athletic prowess that they already know they are guilty of flaunting and are very much proud of. Others might take it as an insult, thinking that it implies that someone is all muscle and no brains. Stereotyping is typing or typecasting, saying to an individual that they are such and such a type, based on an always limited amount of observed characteristics or known associations. Our observations may be limited, or inaccurate, or unfair, or they may be spot on. In any case, whatever label we put on someone will not be complete. Telling someone that they fit such and such a stereotype might be taken as insulting or not. An insult may have been intended or not. According to the valuation equation chart, if someone with intent and someone else's perception both agree that something is not insulting, then it's a good flattering epitome. If someone with intent and someone else's perception both agree that something is insulting, then it's a bad disparaging epitome. In either case, by being archetypally inspired, both outcomes will be seen as expressing archetypal influences, i.e., recurring patterns seen over and over again within and between cultures and times. Or, in the case of human embodiments, recurring patterns of behavior that are seen over and over. Don't confuse a harmless stereotype with harmful stereotyping. So what is a stereotype? And what is the difference between a harmless stereotype and the sometimes harmful act of stereotyping? If we look at common dictionary definitions, the term stereotype is often portrayed with benign language that does not suggest anything malicious. A conventional or formulaic conception or image. Dictionary.com. Sociology. A simplified and standardized conception or image invested with special meaning and held in common by members of a group. The cowboy and Indian are American stereotypes. Dictionary.com. However, if we were to ask people for their definition of stereotyping, we might get some different results. To many, the act of stereotyping means to prejudge, discriminate, humiliate, or degrade, based on the limited information gained from a bigoted point of view. Popular definition. Thus we define a very crucial difference between the noun stereotype and the verb stereotyping, and in doing so give even more weight to the suggested use of the valuation equation chart. Because, based on a dictionary definition of stereotypes, it sounds like a stereotype doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing. Looks like it can just mean formulaic, conventional, and, who knows, maybe even archetypal. Professional comedians are very familiar with the idea of intent, perception, and context being out of balance or in perfect balance. They will craft a joke, often crafted around laughing at the human foibles of a stereotype, and perform that joke in front of many audiences. The intent is always the same, a joke. But different audiences, in different context situations, will laugh or not laugh. Sometimes people who fit the stereotype will laugh, sometimes they will take offense and not laugh. Offense begins where humor ends. That's right, we choose to take offense, or not, when we see someone utilizing a stereotype. Sometimes it seems clear that any reasonable person would agree with us that such and such a use of stereotyping is offensive. Other times, individuals choose to be offended for their own personal reasons. In the end, though, flattering stereotypes or unflattering stereotypes, used in comedy or drama, perceived as malicious or humorous, it doesn't matter. One could well argue that they are all drawn from archetypal influences, and in that way are as cross-cultural as anything. Take those Breakfast Club characters. The movie review that I read called them stereotypes. But doesn't every school in every culture have a brainy type? Doesn't every culture have a rebellious or criminal type? Doesn't every culture have a jock type? Each expression of a jock might not dress exactly like the jock in the movie, but one who focuses on the physical and athletic, possibly to the detriment of their intellect, is probably a pretty universal type. Same with the princess stereotype. Doesn't every culture have its share of princesses who obsess over perfect appearances? Aren't these so-called stereotypes drawing on some pretty universal patterns of behavior seen across a multitude of cultures throughout history? Wouldn't that universality and frequency of occurrence make them archetypally inspired stereotypes? I've been told that if I want my deck to have strong appeal, it has to be an accurate representation of recurring patterns in life. I agree, and I think it is. In fact, in order to prove the validity of that opinion, I would challenge anyone to a simple test of tarot decks. To frame the parameters of this challenge, I would point to the idea of how costumes worn by tarot icons, as well as actual living breathing humans, reveal their archetypal associations, and would subsequently bet anyone that, kids, trying to choose a costume for Halloween would understand the icons in my deck much easier, and in less time, than the icons of most traditional tarot cards. I think a lot of people forget how utterly esoteric traditional tarot images appear to people at first glance. While on the other hand, every Halloween, kids dress up as beauty or beast, hero or villain, wizard or witch, angel or devil, god or ghoul. These are all characters from my decks. Thus, I would challenge anyone to walk into any Halloween costume shop and ask for a costume that represents any of these icons, either by name or by my drawn image. I bet they'll have them all, ready to go. Then, ask them for their hanged man costume, or their chariot costume, or their judgment costume. Show them the tarot card for each one. Ask to see their temperance costume, or wheel of fortune, or tower, or world costumes. In the case of Halloween costumes, I think the context needs to be acknowledged, and the intent needs to be known before any accusations of stereotyping can be made. And I think that all too often, people who object to the use of unflattering icons of humanity are ignoring the context and making assumptions about intent that might not be accurate. Halloween is largely about expressing the dark side of life, with good-natured humor. That's the context. Icons of humanity are the content. Halloween is a time when we are meant to embrace the dark side and laugh at it, as a way of dealing with it. In this way, Halloween demonstrates how important context is to determining the good or bad of something. If unflattering icons of humanity were being used to convince us that a particular race, culture, or nation of people were undesirable and therefore ought to be extinguished, that would be a completely different context with a completely different outcome on the valuation equation chart. Either way, one could still argue that icons of humanity that are archetypal whether used to harm or help. Are the icons of humanity being used in the numerical tarot stereotypes? I think, in the best possible way, they might well be. Because of things like Halloween, they certainly repeat every year, like a fixed or general pattern. They are all conventional or formulaic conceptions or images, or standardized mental pictures that are held in common by members of a group, i.e., just about everyone. I think that makes them not only stereotypical, but also very archetypal. To me, formulaic means simple. A formula is also a pattern. If I am trying to convey to someone the essence of a basic, simple, primordial pattern, why not be formulaic? To me, conventional means patterned. If I want someone to have immediate recognition of what I'm saying, why not be conventional instead of esoteric? Formulaic and conventional might have some bad connotations among those striving to be unique, but I believe the idea of using very simply crafted, highly recognizable personifications as representations of essential patterns is a sound practice. If people see that as insulting and don't want to see it as archetypal, that's fine with me, but I would not agree that it is necessarily evil, and definitely not inaccurate. We all see the characters in my tarot deck again and again, every Halloween, and throughout all of our movies, books, plays, and costumed mythology. In my opinion, the so-called stereotypes from the Breakfast Club movie are pointing to archetypally inspired notions that I believe to be isomorphically identical to that of common tarot cards. The brain points to the same use of intellect as the magician. The jock points to the same ideas of power and influence as the emperor. The princess points to the same ideas of sensitivity and perfection embodied by the empress. The criminal points to ideas of deceptive behavior and evil influence embodied by the devil. The basket case hides under her hood and hair, like a high priestess under her veils. And the authoritarian teacher points to the word of law embodied within the Hierophant. I think it would be rather simple to conclude that because a characterization is unflattering, disparaging, or used to hurt, that it can't be archetypal or point to archetypal influences. But that is an opinion coming from a perspective that views an archetype as a primordial pattern and not the anthropomorphized icon or manifest image seen on a card. I see the Breakfast Club characters as the embodiment of the same primordial patterns as their associated tarot icons. The way I see it, the evils of stereotyping enter the equation by intent, perception, and context, which is why I invented the valuation equation chart. Please use it before calling anything an insulting stereotype or accusing anyone of malicious stereotyping. That's all I have to say about archetypes for now. More in my books. In the meantime, thanks for watching. Hope it all made sense. Links to eBooks, decks, and merchandise below. And, if anyone is interested in drawing a deck based on this system of organization, don't hesitate to contact me for a collaboration.